Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the Prof Talk Pod. My name is Becky Achen, and I am here with my colleague and friend and co-host, Galen Clavio.
What's up?
We are, I think, extra excited about today's topic because it might be we're going to find out one of the times where we don't always agree. I feel like we are relatively agreeable with each other, probably because we've known each other a while and have had a lot of the conversations we're having on the podcast outside of the podcast. But this might be one thing I don't know if I've ever really talked to you about.
I can say I have a pretty comprehensive memory of most of our conversations, and I don't think we've ever even broached this topic. So I was really, when you sent me the rundown of the shows we were going to record, I was like, oh, all right, well.
So now everybody's on the edge of their seats, dying to know the topic of this podcast. So we are actually going to cover just a little bit about imposter syndrome, which is not something, and Galen has taught for a long time. I've been teaching for a little over 10 years. And so it might seem like a little bit of a weird thing to want to talk about because I should be over imposter syndrome by now. But given my new role at the University of Kansas in the professional performance program, which is tangential to my experience in life and the things that I've been researching and learning about over the past, 15 years, it's still different from teaching sport marketing. I could teach sport marketing pretty sure with my eyes closed and backwards and in a dark room with no lights on. Like, it would be so easy because I've been doing it for so long, but the courses I'm teaching now are just different from what I've done in the past. And because of that, there's been a few times, I think this last semester, especially, standing in front of my students in my icons and influence in social media class, where I'm talking to a mostly group of Generation Z people who definitely use more social media than I do. I have a TikTok account only so that I can evaluate my clients' TikTok accounts, but like I don't spend any time on that platform. I spend time reading about it, but I don't spend any time on that platform. And so I'm up here talking about influencers in an age where they are given names of people that I have literally never heard of for good reasons because I'm not in the audience of that influencer, right? A 40-year-old mother is not interested in the Sip Margs brand that Alex Earl promotes with her sweet cowboy hats and, bar scene vibes. And so there's definitely been times in that class where I'm like, wow, like I don't know that reference. And sometimes that sneaks in a little bit in your brain when you're teaching topics that are, fluid and need to be super relevant and you feel like you have a good handle on, but then there's this whole other, targeted group of people that you might not have heard of. And so that's what got me thinking about imposter syndrome, which I'm guessing most people have heard that term before. Just so you know, it's not like in the realm of a psychological condition. It's not diagnosable or anything. It's just described as a psychological experience we have where despite our education or training or knowledge that we know we've got, we still feel like maybe we don't know anything. We're fraudulent. People are going to stand up in the middle of my class and be like, Dr. Aiken, this class is horrible. You are clueless. I'm out. And we might be even like thinking our course evaluations are going to say things like that. And it's something that I hear from new faculty quite often that they experienced early on. But I am really curious, Galen, since it's not something we've ever talked about before. Is that a feeling you've ever had, or do you even believe it's a thing?
Oh boy. Okay, so I'm going to start with my own responses to my personal responses, and then I'll pull the lens back a little more. So no, I've never felt this phenomenon, and I acknowledge that I am probably very unusual within higher ed from that perspective, and I don't think I'm special And I'm almost like, what I find fascinating about higher ed and any, I think, kind of collective, I think journalism actually has a similar kind of thing going on, where there's like a collective conceptualization of what the work conditions are like and what the psychological and emotional experiences that people are having in those areas, might collectively be. When you fundamentally disagree with an idea, you have to kind of evaluate, well, is it me? Am I just missing something that everybody else is dealing with? Or is this something that maybe doesn't actually exist but has gained a lot of traction because it's a convenient thing for a lot of people to point to, because they would like to feel, I kind of look at it the same way that I look at the way that anxiety, which was a diagnosable condition for decades, but has now grown into almost a cottage industry amongst functioning adults who lean on it as a way to explain why they can't or won't do certain things. I kind of feel like imposter syndrome is kind of that, specifically for higher ed. And again, I am not questioning that many people feel what they think is imposter syndrome, where they feel like, I don't know what this information is or that. Now here's what I think is curious. The example you gave, you're teaching a cutting edge technological and content based item that has specific cultural references that you're not familiar with. And you feel like, oh, my students are going to think I'm a fraud for talking about these things. I think that's gone on forever. And it's funny because I think baby boomers and silent generation professors, most of which whom we grew up with, they almost took pride in the fact that they didn't have the core cultural references of the moment. And it was almost a joke between them and their students, who were anywhere between 20 and 40 years younger, that, okay, we don't actually speak the same language in terms of the whatever the lingua franca of the moment is, but here are the concepts that explain and underpin all of these things. And I don't think anybody would accuse you, of all people, of not understanding the business and technological underpinnings of how TikTok operates as far as the larger structural elements of social media. So if you're nervous that people might not, respect you because you can't get all the cultural references, that's been going on for a long time. And I don't think that that counts as far as imposter syndrome. Where I get worried about imposter syndrome, as it's talked about regularly in higher ed, and I hear people talk about it all the time, and this is actually the first time I think I've really opened up on this publicly, but I feel like it harms the development of PhD students, master's students, postdocs, assistant professors, because it almost builds in this idea that, well, you don't know what you're doing and nobody else does. And, everybody feels this. And, to me, it almost handicaps what you can do in the classroom or what you can do with your research, because you are made to feel like there are actual experts out there and you're not one of them. There are actual good teachers and you're not one of them. There are actual good researchers and you're not one of them. And to me, that's a false psychological premise that I hate seeing people fall into, because some of the best ideas, some of the most revolutionary things that come out of both teaching and research tend to be from younger faculty. And yet we've kind of got this non-diagnosable condition, as you accurately pointed out, which is there as a crutch when people have to experience situations where it's new, it feels uncomfortable. That there's a difference between feeling uncomfortable and feeling like an imposter. And I feel like people conflate those way too often in higher ed.
That's an interesting point that I hadn't thought about, we always want to talk about. I always think about trying to empathize with where people are, what they're feeling in a moment, right? But then also sometimes when you normalize a thing to the point where somebody's expecting to feel that way, where's the self-fulfilling prophecy in that, which isn't something that I had thought about before you said what you said, is like it's good to talk about it, but then like what is the damage of potentially people assuming that they're going to feel this way and then maybe not be willing, they're wanting to conform so much to what you said about doing it right, teaching, being a good teacher, a good researcher, being in the field in the right way, and they might not push a boundary because they're worried that that means they're not conforming, and that's going to make their imposter syndrome worse because they're different from,
Yeah.
which
Well,
is not something I thought about.
I mean, I'll even take it a step further, and I think the reason why the conversation around imposter syndrome in higher ed is so consistent and people identify with it so much is this is one of the few industries where your evaluation on a yearly basis is largely predicated on the perception of you by other people, many of whom you don't know. Your teaching evaluations, which we've talked about on the podcast before, are an anonymous form filled out by a bunch of people who may or may not be hostile to you simply because you're an authority figure trying to get them to do things that they would not naturally do themselves. Your service scores are taken into account by a committee of generally your senior peers within your department who may not value what you do to the same degree that you do. Your application for promotion or tenure is decided upon not just by that same body of people within your own school, but then is farmed out to people at other institutions who've never met you before, or maybe just have limited understanding, who are evaluating a bunch of written words and letters. And even your research, if you're a researcher, is being judged by an anonymous panel of people that were selected by somebody else. So, like, the whole thing is really set up as if you have a psychological predisposition towards insecurity and anxiety, this is the wrong field for you to be in. And yet that seems to be a large proportion of the people that get jobs in academia is people who have exactly that psychological predisposition. And so I'm not surprised that people have put a name on it and called it imposter syndrome, because really the whole system is set up to take advantage and put in place, so to speak, those who don't have a strong sense of self-belief in their own abilities. I guess my message in all of this is I think it's almost entirely a construct that has been put into place for that reason, and that it's easy to break through if you don't take the core concept of I am inferior because I don't believe that I should be here. I think a lot of the self-belief thing is a key element to this that helps to dispel it. And I guess that's why perhaps I haven't experienced it in the classroom, because I've always believed if I know something, I have something to say here that's going to be worthwhile, whether it's in a research paper or in a classroom. And if I don't know something, I'll go learn it, as we talked about in our open chat GPT conversation in our last podcast. That's always been how I've approached things. And I think that maybe has helped me to keep the self-doubt at bay that seems to preoccupy so many people when they talk about imposter syndrome.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that. I think that a couple things that may feel differently for different people, especially if we look at different genders or minorities in situations where like you feel already a sense of otherness with the people in the classroom, potentially that might impact your confidence in yourself potentially. And also, teaching, I don't know if this has been your experience, but my experience is that we don't get a ton of feedback from students in the moment. I have students who tell me that my class was so amazing and it was the best class they ever took, and I would have told you that they weren't even awake for most of it,
Right.
because you just don't get that kind of immediate feedback. Whereas in another job, you could go to your supervisor and say like, how am I doing?
Yep.
But and you can do that with your students, right? But you are standing in front of a room full of 20 or 30 or 100 people, and it most of the time, to me in my experience, it looks like they're bored and disinterested. So if you have even just a shred of
Mhm.
initial self-doubt or newness, it's very easy to see how that grows in that environment.
No, no question. But I think that's bad training. It's from my perspective, and we've talked many times on the podcast about the lack of effective pedagogical training at the college level. It's an afterthought, if it's even a thought, in a lot of PhD programs. And I think what that lends itself to is a situation where, to some degree, you need to be thrown into the deep end as a grad student in teaching so that you can get the experience of being in front of a group of people. It is not a naturally pleasant place to be. And for some people, it's always I mean, I kind of think about it the same way that I think about introversion, like, and the idea that there's all these introverts that are suddenly out in society. That we've heard talks about introverts for 20 years. There are introverted people, but being an introvert does not automatically mean that you have to be uncomfortable talking in front of other people, because if you're going to be a professor, you're going to have to do that. Like, it's not an option. So, if you are from a group where you feel like, well, I'm teaching a group of people that I don't have anything in relation with, well, I think you can copy and paste that across a bunch of different things. Like, it can be racial, it could be gender, it could be generational, but a lot of it, I think, comes back to you have to accept and acknowledge that the business that you're in this requires certain things. They aren't things that are imposed upon you against your will. They are things that are part of a broader spectrum of the job. And so I think to some degree we do people a disservice when they're training for this if we aren't putting them in a position where they have to confront that early. Because one of the big and I talk with people about this all the time. So I say I've dealt with it. It's not that I've got anything to deal with, but people are like, "Oh, you're so natural in the classroom, and you're so comfortable up there, and that's just not me." And I have to tell them, like, this is not how I started. Like, I used to be a pretty withdrawn. People will not believe this. I was a withdrawn person. I had a very I was very nervous in front of people. I lacked a lot of self confidence. So I'm not talking from a perspective of someone who's always been very confident in themselves and what they do. In fact, I would say until about age 25, despite being a radio broadcaster, like what I liked about being a radio broadcaster was I didn't have to look at anybody while I was talking. I was just in a booth with a headset on. As far as I was concerned, the audience didn't exist because I had a real hard time philosophically dealing with that. When I became a professor, when I was a grad student and teaching, I had to really talk to myself and be like, I've got to become comfortable with talking in front of people, with being comfortable with the fact that I know things that they don't. And look, if I make a mistake and say something that's inaccurate, I have to be willing to say, I was wrong. Here's what's actually the case. Or yes, you are correct on that. There's all these processes that I think you have to go through, and even the dead classroom thing that you talked about, where you've got people that look like they're not engaged. Again, that's an experiential thing as far as I'm concerned, because I've had the same instance where I've had a class that just looked like they weren't engaged at all, and then you find out later they really loved the class. I've also had classes that looked really engaged, and then you go back and look at the evals, and it's like, well, they didn't really like the class that much. So, so much of it is like there's humps you have to get over, but it's almost like to me, I say we, I don't know who exactly I'm talking about. This is a straw man argument, I guess, to some degree, but it's clear that there's something in higher ed. And I think a lot of it's the process that you have to go through to become a professor. And I experienced this myself as a doc student. There's an effort to almost subjugate emotionally doc students in some programs to where they're almost acting in service roles to the faculty that are in the programs. There's this, and it's like, well, I had to deal with all this stuff when I was a PhD student, so you do too. And what it does is it tends to break the confidence of a lot of people, what little they had, or increase the level of a lack of confidence that they might already be experiencing. And I think you got to go the opposite approach. You've got to try to build up people's belief in themselves while also making sure that they're learning and doing the things that they need in order to have the authority in the classroom or writing a research paper to say, no, this is what I believe and this is what it is and here's how I would justify it. So yeah, it's tough because I think, yes, you can absolutely say you might be predisposed to not feeling comfortable, but it's like that's part of the job. Like, you have to figure out a way around that if you're going to be effective, and that, I think, plays into this whole concept of imposter syndrome.
Well, and you make a good point that, I've number of times I've heard somebody say, "Oh, I got to break that grad student down. I just got to, go into their presentation and basically make them feel inadequate because it's a rite of passage and they should have to handle that." And I think that's one area where whether people feeling of inadequate adequacy enough to have it be detrimental to their ability to do their job. We could do a better job of actually being supportive and still giving criticism in ways that doesn't tear people down, so that when they get in front of the classroom, they actually aren't questioning whether they deserved that PhD. I've got a couple new assistant professors who will say things to me like, I shouldn't have a PhD. Well, well,
Yeah,
but you do.
right.
And you do know the things. You might not know everything about everything. And I think that's another kind of challenge here is there's sometimes that pressure to know everything about everything in your field. And we forget that the people who are full professors 30 years in, they've had 25 years on us to learn more.
Yeah.
And we aren't going to be at the same level of expertise, but giving strategies for how do you manage that feeling. Like, the one thing that I will tell people when they ask me about this feeling is like, you have to be okay with exactly what you said, which is, I got that wrong, or saying, I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to find it out, and being told that's okay. It's okay to be an expert who also needs to do more research.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean,
That's
expertise is not something you attain and then do nothing with. Expertise is a fountain. You know,
Yep.
the knowledge has to keep flowing, and you've got to access that. And so, again, it's like, are there people who are absolutely brilliant in your individual fields? Sure. Are you as brilliant as them? Maybe not, but maybe in certain ways. Maybe you just approach things from a very different perspective. And that the history of science is based upon this whole idea that you have this accepted body of knowledge, and then you have a bunch of young people that come along every generation and reevaluate it and say, I mean, quantum mechanics came out of that, plate tectonics came out of that, communication theory, which we've been dealing with, like the communication theories of the 50s, 60s, and 70s were supplanted later, and then got supplanted again, and that's fine. And I think the problem is, it's a messed up industry if you're coming through it as a PhD candidate, not just because of that and the research, the way that the research is handled and the way that reviews are handled, and that certainly will contribute to a person's sense of inferiority if they are predisposed to think that way, but also in the classroom where you're supposed to be imparting knowledge. And if you have neither the effective training nor the disposition to be a person that does all of that effectively, if you don't have effective mentorship, which again rarely happens on the teaching front, you're probably going to this is where, going back to a lot of earlier episodes, you start to consider the students an obstacle or a nuisance or a threat, not as a group of people that you are working with and trying to help learn things. And so I think, a lot of the things that we talk about in higher ed now, it almost feels like there's a fear that is motivating a lot of people to not do things, or to assume that they don't belong in certain places, and that really isn't warranted. I guess I'm trying. It's weird. It's like, sounds like I'm being negative towards these people. I'm actually saying I want you to be more confident in yourself. You're going to make mistakes, yes. Just, there's very rarely are you going to make career defining mistakes. And I made plenty of mistakes the first 3 or 4 years, but it's you're the chances are, if you got hired by an institution, you belonged there. There's very few people who get hired, do their work, and then everybody's like, you didn't belong here. Sorry. Like, that doesn't happen that much.
Well, I'd say the same thing too. Like, chances are you didn't get a PhD by accident because it does require work and effort. Now, you might not have gotten trained to teach while you were there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have the knowledge in the field, and you shouldn't be questioning your ability to impart knowledge and teach people. And when we think about this, whether somebody feels imposter syndrome is the thing that they experience or not, we all have self-doubt, and occasionally, and especially when you're new, it is normal to feel trepidation or worry about doing something wrong or not being good enough. Like, all of those things are normal ways to feel, and ways that a lot of people, not Galen, but a lot of people have felt in their careers. So what are some actionable things that you can do? And we've said a couple of them. A couple of them, revolve around being okay saying things like, I don't know, I'll find out. I got that wrong. Let me correct it. The more that you can connect with students as an authentic person, that actually might also help you remove some of those imposter syndrome feelings, because then you're not also putting yourself on a pedestal of somebody who is greater than or better than. Instead, you are a person who has an interest that the students are also interested in, and then you build the classroom experience to help you explore that together. I
Mhm.
found those to be good ways, at least for me, to think about when those doubts are creeping in, like, do I belong here? Do I know this? Can I do this? Those are good ways to remind myself that this isn't actually, it isn't even about me,
Right.
right?
Yeah, I think all of that makes sense. And I guess, what I would recommend to people, if you feel like you're legitimately, if you really feel I don't belong here, give yourself some easy wins to start with. Put yourself in a position where you design a project for the classroom, you pilot it with some students, and then you put it out more broadly, and accept the fact that, hey, you did that right. Uh, you know, Ask students, like, what's going well with the class, what can I improve upon. Take feedback and look at it. I think you'll find just through that process you're not doing anything so horrifically wrong that it's being pointed out within the comments of people who have no idea why you're asking them the comments in the first place, other than we'd like I want the class to be better, tell me why. um, Seek out faculty and administrators within your school or department that are supportive, that you feel like you have a good rapport with, and ask them questions, ask them about their background. I think you'll find that the people you think are the experts and think are the people that you should be idolizing and holding up as standards probably came from the exact same place you did, and probably at times are like, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm just kind of winging it. um, I think I guess the core thing, and this is what I'll end on. Stop assuming that everybody else knows what they're doing and you don't. I mean, that's to me, and I guess that's where I find the concept of imposter syndrome unpalatable, is that it assumes that there are other people that are doing it right and have the answers and you don't. And I don't think that's true. I think I mean, I don't experience it, but I also don't think I do everything right. I just don't feel like if I do something wrong that it's some kind of indictment on me as a person or as a professional, because we're all to some degree reacting in the moment to things that happen, and then we make adjustments based upon what occurred there and what we learned from it. And that's not imposter syndrome. That's just called becoming a professional and learning how to do things over time. I think you'd find that in any industry. It's just we happen to have an industry here in higher ed that's set up to make you feel inferior basically from the moment you start.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right about that. And from a broader perspective, this might not help individual faculty, but for those of you that are listening that have PhD students or graduate students or run programs or are administrators, what are some ways that you can build in confidence building into your degree programs so that we aren't feeling when we graduate that we are already inadequate, because that's what we were taught when we were grad students. It's kind of like that, like, why haze the freshmen on the team? Like, why make them feel like crap? Don't you need them for your team to be successful? It's kind of the same concept, and we can apply those strategies and ideas for building in some of that confidence work while we're getting our PhDs. It doesn't always have to be about learning stats and theory. There's lots of other important things we could teach in our PhD programs.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, look, and I'll be the first to say, like, there's a very particular set of skills you have to develop as a PhD student. But I mean, it's kind of like if you look at people that come out of the Greek system, like, don't haze the freshman just because you were hazed as a freshman. Like, break the cycle of abuse. And it's not physical abuse, hopefully, with PhD students, but it's a lot of mental and emotional abuse. Even if you don't think that it is, and even if you experienced it, think about how that made you feel. Did it really make you a better researcher? Did it really make you a better teacher? And I bet you'd discover, if you really broke it down, that it probably didn't.
Yeah. Great. Well, I just want to reiterate one thing Galen said as a final point, because I think it's so important to remind yourself that this being in higher ed, being a teacher, being a researcher isn't necessarily about always having the right answer, because the right answer evolves and changes. That's why there is science to explore and get closer to truth. The same thing is true with how we teach our classes, how we interact with students. Like, sure, there are best practices, but you are not searching for the way to do it right. Like, that's just not a reality that exists. And if you can remove that pressure from yourself and recognize that there are a lot of us that are just trying to figure it out as we go, have open conversations about challenges that you're having, and don't feel like doing that makes you less than your colleagues, that will help improve some of these feelings of anxiety.
I
All
think that's
right.
a good way to end on it. Yes, absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you all for listening. We appreciate you, and any feedback you might have about the podcast or topics, please rate and review this on Spotify or Apple, wherever you listen. Follow us or subscribe on YouTube, and we will see you next time.